You should learn how to manage your money at your age, Margaret, Linda said with a light laugh, lifting her glass as if she had just delivered something clever instead of cruel. The comment hung in the air over the white tablecloth and half-finished iced teas, sharp enough to silence the rest of the family seated around the patio table in Linda's backyard in Greenwich, Connecticut. Margaret Whitmore, 72 years old, sat very still in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight despite the humid June afternoon pressing against her shoulders. She had asked for $100. Just $100. A temporary loan to cover a prescription refill until her quarterly pension distribution cleared. She had spoken softly, almost apologetically, not wanting to draw attention. Linda had drawn it for her. Maybe it's time to downsize, Linda added, smiling toward her husband as if this were all harmless banter. Or take one of those budgeting classes at the community center. A few nervous chuckles circled the table. Margaret did not laugh. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded once, as though she had just been given useful advice, and reached for her water glass. From the outside, she looked like what everyone believed her to be, a widowed woman living modestly on Social Security and a small pension, driving a 10-year-old Buick, clipping coupons from the Sunday paper, wearing the same pearl earrings she had owned for decades. What no one at that table knew, what Linda certainly did not know, was that 2 weeks earlier, Margaret had received a certified letter from her late husband's investment firm in Boston. The letter had been brief, almost understated, informing her that a long-term private equity position Harold Whitmore had entered nearly 20 years ago had matured. After fees and taxes, the distribution available to Margaret totaled $3,500,000. The number had not made her gasp. It had not made her cry. She had simply read it twice, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back into its envelope. Harold had always believed in quiet strategy. He used to say that real security was built in silence. Sitting at Linda's table now, Margaret remembered that. She also remembered something else. Years ago, when Harold was ill, Linda had insisted on helping with paperwork, offering to organize accounts and simplify access in case of emergency. At the time, Margaret had been grateful. She had signed where she was told. She had trusted her sister. As Linda's laughter faded and conversation shifted to vacation homes and rising property taxes, Margaret's mind moved elsewhere. She replayed recent bank statements in her head, small discrepancies she had dismissed as clerical errors. Transfers she did not fully recognize. She felt no surge of anger, no dramatic sting of humiliation. What she felt was clarity. When lunch ended, Margaret stood, smoothed the front of her pale blue blouse, and thanked Linda for hosting. Linda gave her a quick hug, light and distracted, already turning to refill someone's drink. Margaret walked to her Buick, the leather seats warm from the sun, and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. A lined face. Steady blue eyes. Not fragile. Not confused. Not dependent. She thought about the $100. About the laughter. About the assumption that she was small. Then she reached into her handbag and touched the edge of the envelope she had brought with her that morning, the one detailing the $3.5 million distribution. She had not mentioned it. She had not corrected Linda. She had not needed to. Instead, she started the engine and drove home to the quiet ranch-style house she had shared with Harold for 43 years, already deciding that first thing Monday morning, she would meet with her attorney and her bank. Silence, she knew now, was not weakness. It was preparation. On Monday morning Margaret Whitmore woke before sunrise, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a delivery truck passing on Maple Ridge Drive, and she moved through her kitchen with the same measured routine she had followed for years, grinding coffee beans, setting a single white mug on the counter, and opening the folder she had placed beside the toaster the night before. Inside were copies of recent bank statements, the certified letter from the Boston investment firm, and several documents from years ago when Harold had amended certain accounts during his illness. She had highlighted nothing and circled nothing. She did not need visual reminders. She knew exactly which transactions did not belong. There had been 3 transfers over the past 18 months that moved modest but meaningful amounts from a secondary investment account into an external account she did not recognize. At the time she had assumed Harold must have arranged something before he passed, but the dates told a different story. The transfers had occurred long after the funeral, long after she had learned to sleep alone in a king-sized bed that suddenly felt too wide. Margaret sat at her small oak dining table and read each line again, not searching for outrage but for confirmation. She found it in the authorization signatures attached digitally to the older access permissions Linda had once insisted would make emergencies easier. Margaret remembered sitting in a hospital waiting room 5 years ago while Linda held a clipboard and spoke confidently about simplifying paperwork. Margaret had been tired then, grateful for help, willing to believe that shared blood guaranteed shared integrity. She sipped her coffee and felt no tremor in her hands. At 9 o'clock sharp she drove to the local branch of Fairfield Trust Bank, the same branch where she and Harold had opened their first joint savings account 4 decades earlier when interest rates were still printed on chalkboards behind the counter. The building looked unchanged, red brick and tall glass windows reflecting the late spring light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and polished wood. She asked to speak with the branch manager, a man named Thomas Reed who had replaced the previous manager 2 years ago. Thomas greeted her with professional warmth, unaware that the woman standing before him held documents that could quietly shift several lives. Margaret placed the folder on his desk and asked him to review the historical access attached to her accounts. She did not accuse. She did not speculate. She simply asked for a full audit and an immediate freeze on any external links that had been authorized before her husband's death. Thomas listened carefully, his expression shifting from routine courtesy to focused attention as he scanned the dates and signatures. He explained that because some authorizations predated certain policy changes, they might have remained active unless formally revoked. Margaret nodded. She requested written confirmation of the freeze and asked that any irregular transfers be escalated to the compliance department for review. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle, as if she were ordering a new checkbook rather than initiating a financial investigation. By the time she left the bank, she carried a printed receipt confirming temporary restrictions on the questioned accounts and a promise that compliance would respond within 48 hours. She drove home slowly, passing manicured lawns and white picket fences that looked as stable as her family once had. When she pulled into her driveway, she did not feel triumph. She felt alignment. The pieces were no longer scattered memories or faint suspicions. They were structured, documented, and in motion. Somewhere across town, Linda was likely planning her next social luncheon or reviewing property listings online, confident in the image she had always maintained. Margaret stepped inside her quiet house and placed the bank receipt beside Harold's old leather portfolio. Silence filled the room, but it was no longer empty. It was deliberate, steady, and waiting. 2 days after her visit to the bank, Margaret Whitmore received a call just before noon while she was trimming the lavender bushes along the narrow walkway leading to her front porch, and when she saw the number for Fairfield Trust Bank on her cell phone screen she removed her gardening gloves slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment rather than waiting for it. Thomas Reed's voice was calm but noticeably more formal than before as he informed her that the compliance department had completed a preliminary review of the flagged transactions and confirmed that 3 electronic transfers had indeed been executed using legacy authorization credentials tied to an external account registered under Linda Whitmore's name, and although the amounts were not extraordinary when viewed individually, their cumulative total over time represented a significant misuse of access privileges. Margaret listened without interrupting, her gaze resting on the white siding of her house where sunlight reflected gently against the windows Harold had installed himself 20 years earlier. Thomas explained that the bank had immediately frozen the external account pending further review and that any remaining linked permissions had been revoked, and he also stated that because the transfers involved potential fiduciary misconduct, the matter would be formally documented and could escalate beyond internal resolution if necessary. Margaret thanked him in the same steady tone she used when ordering groceries or scheduling a dental appointment and asked that all findings be sent to her attorney in writing. When the call ended, she did not return to the lavender. Instead, she walked inside, washed her hands carefully at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the oak table with a small notepad. She wrote only 3 words in neat script: "It is confirmed." Across town, Linda was discovering her own version of confirmation. That afternoon, while attempting to complete an online payment for a kitchen renovation deposit, she was met with a notification that her account was temporarily restricted. Assuming it was a technical error, she tried a different card and received the same message. Within an hour she was on hold with the bank, her voice tight with impatience as she demanded clarification. The representative informed her that certain accounts were under review and that she would need to speak directly with the compliance department for further information. For the first time in years, Linda did not have immediate answers. By early evening, her calls to various contacts yielded little reassurance, and she did what she had not done in months. She dialed her sister. Margaret was seated in her living room at that moment, reading through the formal email summary Thomas had just forwarded, when her phone vibrated on the side table. She looked at the name displayed on the screen and let it ring twice before answering. Linda did not begin with pleasantries. She asked whether Margaret had spoken to the bank and whether she knew anything about the so-called review affecting her accounts. Margaret responded that she had requested a standard audit after noticing discrepancies and that the bank was simply following protocol. Her tone remained even, neither defensive nor accusatory. Linda's voice shifted from irritation to urgency as she insisted there must be some misunderstanding and reminded Margaret that she had only ever tried to help when Harold was ill. Margaret did not challenge the memory. She simply replied that help should never require secrecy. There was a long pause on the line, filled not with shouting but with the sound of breathing and the faint echo of traffic in the background on Linda's end. Margaret then informed her sister, calmly and without emphasis, that she had also finalized the distribution of Harold's matured investment fund and that all assets had been consolidated under a newly established trust managed exclusively by her attorney. The silence that followed carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Linda asked how much the fund had been worth, and Margaret answered plainly, $3,500,000 after taxes. There was no pride in her voice, only fact. For years, Linda had believed she understood her younger sister's limitations. She had mistaken simplicity for vulnerability, modest living for incapacity. Now the foundation of that assumption was shifting beneath her. Margaret ended the call not with anger but with a simple statement that any further communication regarding finances should go through her attorney. When she placed the phone back on the table, the room felt unchanged, yet something fundamental had moved into place. Outside, the trimmed lavender rested quietly in the evening light, and Margaret understood that what had begun as a small humiliation over $100 had unfolded into a revelation about power, trust, and the cost of underestimating a woman who had learned patience long before anyone thought to test it. The next morning Margaret Whitmore did not wake with urgency, yet the air in her house felt different, as if the walls themselves were aware that a line had been crossed and quietly redrawn. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains in the living room, casting pale rectangles across the hardwood floor Harold had refinished by hand the summer before he retired. Margaret moved slowly through her routine, brewing coffee, watering the fern by the window, folding the blanket draped over the back of the sofa. Discipline had always steadied her. While Linda was likely pacing across polished tile floors in a kitchen twice the size of Margaret's entire living area, Margaret sat at her oak table reviewing the email from her attorney, Daniel Mercer, who had already received the compliance report from Fairfield Trust Bank. The language was formal and precise. It confirmed that the question transfers had been executed using access credentials that should have been terminated upon Harold's death but were not, due to administrative oversight. It also stated that because the external account holder had benefited directly, the matter qualified as unauthorized use of financial authority. Daniel had outlined 2 options. The first involved pursuing civil recovery and potential legal consequences. The second involved formalizing a settlement agreement in which the funds would be returned in full with documented acknowledgement of misconduct, thereby avoiding public escalation. Margaret read both options twice. She did not rush to circle one. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and allowed memory to surface. She remembered being a little girl standing behind Linda at the kitchen sink in their childhood home in Hartford, watching her older sister rinse dishes while directing everyone else with confident efficiency. Linda had always been decisive, always certain she knew what was best. Margaret had grown accustomed to yielding small spaces in order to keep peace. That pattern had followed them into adulthood. Even when Harold had begun to struggle with hospital forms and medication schedules, it was Linda who stepped forward with binders and instructions. Margaret had interpreted that control as competence. Now, sitting alone in the quiet house, she recognized it as something else. She reached for her phone and called Daniel. Her voice was steady as she informed him that she preferred the second option. She did not want courtrooms or headlines. She wanted clarity and restitution. Daniel agreed to draft a formal demand letter outlining the amount owed, including interest calculated at standard market rates, and requiring signed acknowledgement within 10 business days. After ending the call, Margaret stood and walked to the hallway closet where Harold's old leather briefcase rested on the top shelf. She carried it to the dining table and placed inside it the investment distribution documents, the bank's compliance summary, and a copy of the trust agreement that now protected every dollar under her name alone. She was not assembling weapons. She was assembling boundaries. Late that afternoon her phone vibrated again. This time it was not Linda's number but a text message from Linda's husband asking if they could meet to discuss what he called a misunderstanding. Margaret read the message without responding immediately. She poured herself a glass of water, sat in the armchair near the front window, and watched a neighbor walk a golden retriever down the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued without disruption. After several minutes she typed a brief reply stating that all financial matters would be handled through her attorney and that any personal conversation could occur only after the settlement terms were reviewed. She pressed send and set the phone aside. The power dynamic that had once operated quietly in Linda's favor had shifted, not through raised voices but through documentation, structure, and patience. As evening settled over Maple Ridge Drive, Margaret felt no desire for revenge. What she felt instead was a calm reclamation of space. For the first time since Harold's passing, she understood that protecting herself did not require confrontation. It required resolve. And resolve, she had in abundance. 3 days after the formal demand letter was delivered by certified mail, Margaret Whitmore was arranging fresh white tulips in a clear glass vase when her doorbell rang just before 4 in the afternoon, earlier than most visitors and too deliberate to be accidental. She set the vase carefully at the center of the dining table and walked toward the front door without hurry. Through the narrow sidelight window she saw Linda standing on the porch, not in one of her tailored blazers but in a simple cardigan, her posture less rigid than usual. Margaret opened the door but did not step aside immediately. Linda's eyes were rimmed with fatigue, the kind that comes from sleepless nights rather than travel. She held no purse, no folder, no shield of polished composure. She asked if they could talk. Margaret studied her sister's face for a long moment, then moved slightly to allow her inside. The living room felt smaller with both of them standing there, sunlight stretching across the rug Harold had purchased on a road trip years ago. Linda began speaking before she fully sat down. She said the letter had been shocking, that she had never intended harm, that the transfers had been temporary adjustments meant to stabilize investments during volatile months. Margaret listened without crossing her arms or interrupting. When Linda's voice grew tight, she shifted to describing mounting pressure from mortgage payments, property taxes, and an upcoming tuition bill for her grandson's private school. She said she had always believed she would return the money once certain deals closed. Margaret folded her hands loosely in her lap and allowed the explanation to unfold completely. When silence finally settled between them, she spoke quietly. She said that temporary help does not require concealment, and that family support does not involve electronic signatures used without conversation. Linda's composure cracked not into anger but into visible strain. She admitted that she had assumed Margaret would never notice, that the amounts were small compared to overall holdings, and that she had convinced herself it was harmless. The admission did not echo loudly in the room, yet it carried weight. Margaret rose and retrieved Harold's leather briefcase from the dining table, placing it gently on the coffee table between them. She opened it and removed copies of the compliance report, the trust documentation, and the finalized settlement agreement prepared by Daniel Mercer. The documents were arranged neatly, each page aligned. She explained that the funds had already been consolidated under the trust and that any future attempt to access accounts would trigger automatic review. She also stated that the settlement required full repayment within 30 days, including calculated interest, and that failure to comply would move the matter beyond private resolution. Linda's eyes moved across the pages slowly, absorbing the structure and finality of what lay before her. For the first time in their lives, Linda was not directing the narrative. She placed the documents down and whispered that she did not have that kind of liquidity available. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply replied that assets could be sold, lines of credit renegotiated, priorities reassessed. The same practical tone Linda had once used in hospital corridors now rested with Margaret. The power shift was not theatrical. It was procedural. Linda's shoulders lowered as if something invisible had been removed. She said she had misjudged her sister, that she had mistaken restraint for dependence. Margaret nodded once. She told Linda that respect is often invisible until it is tested. There were no dramatic gestures, no threats, no tears falling to the carpet. Only two aging sisters sitting in a quiet Connecticut living room confronting the cost of assumption. As dusk approached and shadows lengthened across the hardwood floor, Linda gathered the documents carefully and stood to leave, promising to contact her attorney within the week. Margaret walked her to the door and opened it to the cooling evening air. When Linda stepped onto the porch, she paused, looking back as if searching for a version of their relationship that no longer existed. Margaret offered no reassurance, only a steady gaze. After the door closed, the house returned to silence, but it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of boundaries defined and maintained. Margaret returned to the dining table, adjusted the tulips so that they stood upright, and allowed herself a small exhale. The situation was not resolved, yet the balance had shifted decisively. For years she had occupied the quiet corner of their dynamic. Now she occupied the center, not through force, but through clarity, documentation, and unwavering composure. 1 week after Linda left Margaret Whitmore's house with the settlement documents in her hands, the quiet rhythm of Maple Ridge Drive continued as if nothing had shifted, yet beneath that stillness negotiations were unfolding through attorneys and structured phone calls that never once required Margaret to raise her voice. Daniel Mercer informed her that Linda's legal counsel had acknowledged the validity of the compliance report and was requesting a revised payment schedule, citing liquidity constraints tied to real estate holdings and investment properties. Margaret listened to the explanation while seated at her dining table, a legal pad resting beside her coffee cup. She did not react to the phrase liquidity constraints. She simply asked Daniel to outline the proposed terms. The offer arrived in writing that afternoon. It suggested partial repayment over 12 months with interest recalculated at a lower rate. Margaret read the proposal carefully, then folded the paper once and placed it beside Harold's briefcase. She walked to the front window and watched a school bus pause at the corner before continuing down the street. Ordinary families were managing ordinary obligations. That had always been her understanding of responsibility. When Daniel called back to request her decision, she spoke without hesitation. She agreed to a structured repayment, but only under conditions that included immediate liquidation of a secondary investment property owned by Linda and direct escrow oversight by Daniel's office. There would be no informal transfers, no private assurances. Every dollar would move through documented channels. Daniel paused briefly, perhaps surprised by the clarity of her terms, then confirmed he would communicate the counteroffer. 2 days later, Linda herself called again. Her voice was subdued, stripped of the confidence that once defined it. She said she had not expected Margaret to insist on property liquidation. She mentioned sentimental value and long-term plans. Margaret responded that sentiment had not been considered when electronic transfers were made without her knowledge. The words were delivered calmly, without accusation. Linda exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. She said she felt cornered. Margaret corrected her gently. She said that consequences are not corners. They are results. Silence followed, heavier than before. Eventually Linda admitted that the sale paperwork for the property had already begun. She asked whether, once repayment was complete, the matter would remain private. Margaret assured her that confidentiality had always been her preference, provided that obligations were honored in full. There would be no public exposure, no extended family discussions, no humiliation. Only completion. Over the next several weeks, escrow documents were signed and monitored. Funds began returning to the trust account in scheduled increments. Margaret tracked each deposit with the same discipline Harold had once applied to ledger books spread across their kitchen table. She felt neither vindication nor pleasure in watching the numbers adjust. What she felt instead was equilibrium. On a crisp Thursday morning in early autumn, Daniel called to confirm that the final wire transfer had cleared. The full amount, including agreed interest, had been restored. Margaret thanked him and asked that a formal acknowledgement letter be drafted confirming resolution. When she hung up, she remained seated for a long moment, hands resting quietly on the table. Across town, Linda was navigating the practical aftermath of selling property and restructuring debt, her lifestyle subtly altered by the necessity of compliance. Margaret did not inquire about those details. They were no longer her concern. Later that afternoon she walked to the bank herself, not because she needed to, but because she preferred to see completion in person. Thomas Reed greeted her with measured respect as he confirmed the updated trust balance and removed the temporary review flags from her profile. Margaret signed the final acknowledgement and stepped back into the cool autumn air. The maple trees lining the street had begun to turn shades of amber and gold. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the steady weight of restored order. The lesson had not required anger. It had required patience, documentation, and the refusal to confuse silence with surrender. And in that refusal, she had reclaimed more than money. She had reclaimed authority. By the time winter settled over Connecticut, Margaret Whitmore had returned to a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its steadiness, yet beneath that calm surface she sensed that something deeper had shifted not only in her accounts but in the architecture of her relationships. Snow fell lightly across Maple Ridge Drive, softening rooftops and quieting the neighborhood in the way only December can. Margaret stood at her living room window one evening, watching the streetlights glow against the thin layer of ice forming along the sidewalks, and she realized that the silence surrounding her no longer felt like absence. It felt like choice. The trust account statements arrived monthly, each one precise and orderly. The restored funds had already been reallocated into diversified investments under Daniel Mercer's oversight, structured to generate stable income well beyond what she would need. For the first time since Harold's passing, Margaret began considering possibilities rather than precautions. She met with a financial advisor recommended by Daniel, not because she doubted her security, but because she wanted clarity about legacy planning. She listened as projections were outlined, as charitable giving strategies were explained, as estate structures were modeled on spreadsheets displayed across a polished conference table. She asked thoughtful questions, not about accumulation, but about impact. The advisor mentioned options for establishing a scholarship fund in Harold's name at the local community college, a place Harold had once attended on a part-time basis while working construction jobs in his 20s. Margaret felt something steady and warm move through her at the thought. Across town, Linda's presence had grown noticeably quieter. Holiday gatherings that once revolved around her carefully curated dinners were now smaller, more restrained. When an invitation arrived for a modest family Christmas Eve dinner at Linda's home, Margaret considered it carefully before accepting. She arrived precisely at 6 in the evening, wearing a simple navy wool coat and the pearl earrings she had worn for decades. The house looked the same on the surface, decorated with garlands and white lights, yet the atmosphere felt tempered. Conversations were polite. No one mentioned banks, properties, or transfers. Linda approached Margaret in the kitchen at one point, offering a glass of sparkling water. Her voice was soft, almost cautious. She said she appreciated the discretion Margaret had maintained and acknowledged that the resolution had forced her to reassess certain assumptions. Margaret met her gaze without hostility. She responded that accountability is not humiliation when handled with honesty. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it carried more substance than many of their previous years of interaction. Later that evening, as grandchildren unwrapped gifts near the fireplace, Margaret observed Linda from across the room. The dynamic had altered in subtle but unmistakable ways. Linda no longer spoke over her. She no longer corrected small details in conversation. She listened. Respect, Margaret understood, had not been requested. It had been demonstrated. After the holidays, Margaret finalized the establishment of the Whitmore Technical Scholarship Fund, endowing it with a portion of the matured investment returns. She attended the first small ceremony at the community college auditorium in early spring, sitting in the second row. While the college dean announced the new fund supporting first-generation students pursuing vocational training. When Harold's name was spoken aloud, Margaret felt a quiet alignment between past and present. The wealth that had once been nearly dismissed as invisible had become purposeful. In the months that followed, Margaret found herself walking a little taller, not because of the numbers reflected in statements, but because she had proven something essential to herself. She had proven that dignity does not require display and that patience can outlast presumption. One afternoon, as she trimmed the same lavender bushes that had witnessed the first confirmation call from the bank, a neighbor stopped to comment on how well the plants had endured the winter. Margaret smiled and said that strong roots make a difference. The comment was simple, yet it carried a truth she now understood fully. What had begun as a moment of public laughter over a modest request had unfolded into a revelation about strength, structure, and the quiet authority of a woman who no longer needed to explain her value. And as the seasons turned once again along Maple Ridge Drive, Margaret Whitmore stood firmly in a life she had reclaimed, measured not by the size of her accounts, but by the steadiness of her boundaries and the clarity of her resolve. Spring settled fully over Connecticut, and with it came a clarity that felt less like victory and more like alignment. Margaret Whitmore found herself rising earlier than usual, not out of restlessness but out of quiet anticipation for days that now felt entirely her own. The Whitmore Technical Scholarship Fund had begun receiving applications, and the community college had invited her to review personal statements from the first round of students. She sat at her oak dining table one morning with a stack of essays, reading about young men and women who worked night shifts at grocery stores, who cared for younger siblings, who believed that learning a skilled trade could change the trajectory of their families. As she turned each page, she thought about Harold in his 20s, grease on his hands from construction work, textbooks balanced on the kitchen counter of their first small apartment. Money, she understood now, was not simply security. It was direction. Across town, Linda had adjusted to a quieter lifestyle. The sale of her investment property had reduced certain luxuries, and conversations about renovation plans or overseas vacations had grown rare. Word traveled gently within extended family circles that financial restructuring had taken place, though no details were shared. Margaret had kept her promise of discretion. She spoke of the matter to no one outside her attorney and her financial advisor. The silence she maintained was not secrecy. It was restraint. One Sunday afternoon, several months after the final repayment cleared, Linda called and asked if Margaret would join her for a walk along the harbor in Stamford. The request was simple, almost tentative. Margaret agreed. The sky that day was a pale blue, and sailboats drifted slowly across the water as the two sisters walked side by side along the wooden boardwalk. Their steps were measured, neither rushing nor lingering. Linda spoke first. She said that the months following the settlement had forced her to examine patterns she had long ignored. She admitted that control had often felt like responsibility, and that she had mistaken her own confidence for entitlement. Margaret listened, hands clasped loosely in front of her coat. She did not interrupt. When Linda finished, Margaret responded that trust is not sustained by proximity or blood alone. It is sustained by transparency. The conversation was not emotional. It was honest. There were no dramatic apologies or theatrical gestures. Only two women acknowledging the weight of choices made and consequences lived through. As they reached the end of the pier, Linda stopped and looked out over the water. She said she had underestimated her sister, and that the assumption had cost her more than money. Margaret met her gaze steadily and replied that underestimation is often a reflection of one's own blind spots. They stood there for a moment, wind lifting strands of silver hair, before turning back toward the parking lot. The exchange did not erase the past, but it altered the future. In the weeks that followed, communication between them became simpler. Fewer directives. More questions. Margaret did not seek dominance. She did not need to. The balance had already been recalibrated. At home on Maple Ridge Drive, the lavender bushes bloomed again, their scent drifting lightly through open windows. Margaret found herself spending evenings on the front porch with a cup of tea, watching neighbors pass and listening to the distant hum of traffic blending into the warm air. She no longer measured her worth against assumptions, or laughter or comparisons. She measured it in the steadiness of her breath and the clarity of her decisions. The trust account continued to grow modestly under careful management. The scholarship recipients were announced at a small ceremony in early June, and Margaret shook hands with each student, looking into eyes that carried both uncertainty and determination. As she returned home that evening, she reflected on the path that had led her there. A request once dismissed had uncovered a deeper truth about strength, boundaries, and quiet authority. What remained was not resentment, nor triumph, but a calm understanding that dignity, when protected with patience, becomes unshakable. And in that understanding, Margaret Whitmore walked forward, not louder than before, but steadier than ever. Summer returned once more to Connecticut, and with it came a sense of completion that Margaret Whitmore did not announce to anyone, yet carried quietly within her movements. Maple Ridge Drive looked much the same as it had a year earlier, lawns trimmed neatly, children riding bicycles in wide looping circles, neighbors exchanging brief waves across hedges. From the outside, nothing dramatic had occurred. Yet inside the modest ranch-style home where Margaret lived, the architecture of her life had been restructured with intention and clarity. The Whitmore Technical Scholarship Fund had completed its first full year, and the initial recipients had already begun their training programs in electrical work, automotive technology, and advanced manufacturing. One afternoon, Margaret received a handwritten letter from a 19-year-old student named Caleb who wrote that without the scholarship he would have delayed school indefinitely while working double shifts at a warehouse. Margaret read the letter twice, then placed it carefully inside Harold's old leather briefcase alongside the original investment documents. The circle felt complete in a way that did not require applause. Linda's presence in Margaret's life had stabilized into something quieter and more measured. Their conversations were no longer layered with subtle competition or unspoken hierarchies. When they met for coffee in late August at a small cafe overlooking Long Island Sound, Linda spoke openly about restructuring her finances and simplifying her lifestyle. She described selling unnecessary assets, reducing debt, and learning to consult rather than assume. Margaret listened without judgment. There was no satisfaction in hearing of sacrifice, only acknowledgement that growth had occurred. Linda paused at one point and said she had once believed money defined security, but that losing control had revealed how fragile that definition was. Margaret responded that security is not the size of one's account. It is the strength of one's boundaries. The words were not sharp. They were steady. As the months continued, Margaret found herself involved more frequently at the community college, attending advisory board meetings and mentoring scholarship recipients informally. She never mentioned the incident that had set everything in motion. She did not need to. The transformation was internal, not performative. She had learned that quiet composure, when paired with documentation and resolve, can alter the course of events more effectively than confrontation. One crisp October morning, almost exactly 1 year after she had walked into Fairfield Trust Bank to request an audit, Margaret returned to the same branch to review annual statements. Thomas Reed greeted her with the same respectful tone, now tinged with familiarity. He confirmed that her portfolio had grown steadily and that the trust was performing ahead of conservative projections. Margaret thanked him and declined any aggressive expansion strategies. She preferred sustainability over spectacle. As she stepped outside into the cool air, leaves scattering along the sidewalk, she reflected briefly on the moment at the patio table when laughter had filled the space after her modest request. That memory no longer carried humiliation. It carried contrast. Contrast between assumption and reality, between appearance and structure, between noise and silence. When she returned home, she placed her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door and paused in the living room where afternoon light spilled gently across the hardwood floor. The house did not feel empty. It felt anchored. Harold's photograph rested on the mantel, his expression unchanged, steady as ever. Margaret stood before it for a moment and allowed herself a small, private smile. Not because she had proven something to others, but because she had proven something to herself. Strength does not announce itself. It organizes itself. It prepares quietly. It waits until the proper moment, then acts without chaos. The woman who had once been dismissed over $100 now managed millions with discipline and intention, yet she measured her success not in numbers but in equilibrium. Her life was not louder. It was clearer. And as autumn deepened across Connecticut, Margaret Whitmore continued forward with the calm assurance of someone who understood that dignity, once defended with patience and precision, becomes a permanent foundation rather than a fragile illusion.